Typest is a really nice software that allows you to take simple markdown code and generate beautiful PDF files from that. And in today's video, I want to show you how to combine both Typest and R and stick them together to create parameterized reports. And note that I'm not using Quarto here, which is of course every R user's favorite way of generating parameterized reports, but in a lot of simple cases it's really not that necessary to involve Quarto, and instead you can just take your existing Typest projects, put in some placeholders and then modify those using R. So with that said, let me show you how that works. Okay, so today we start a little bit differently. Usually I always jump straight into Positron, our favorite IDE, to write some R code. But today I want to show you first a Typest script that we're going to modify. Of course we could use Positron to look into this, but here I'm using my browser because I like to use the Typest app to write Typest code wherever I am, whether on my computer or on my laptop. So here I am inside of the Typest app, and you can see here that I have a whole bunch of Typest code. If you're not that familiar with Typest, don't worry about it. You should be able to still follow along quite well. So as you can see, it is basically generating an invoice that we have on the right hand side here, and it contains the typical stuff like an address of myself, an address of my client I'm working with, stuff like invoice ID, invoice date, and so on, and then a simple line by line list of invoice positions that I'm billing. And then at the end we have some payment information. All of this is generated using this Typest code here, and I don't want to go into the details here because honestly most of this was written by ChatGPT, as it is really good at writing boilerplate code like this, and then I tweaked it to fit my style. In any case, we can see here that there are a bunch of tables in here, and one such table is this table here that corresponds to the invoice lines that we see inside of our PDF. And once we're happy with this template here, if we've seen in our live editor how this thing works, we can just take this code and then put it into a Typest file on our computer. So here I've simply stick this into a file called recording.type on my computer, and I simply copy and pasted this. And now to make a template out of this that we can use in combination with R, let's just get rid of all of the line entries here, all but the first line, and then let's replace the stuff that we have on this line here with some placeholders. So what we could do here is to put in a placeholder here in all caps that says this is line item. The next entry will be a placeholder for hours. The next thing will be an hourly rate, and the next thing will be a line amount. So really we've done nothing but throw in a few placeholders into our Typest document, and you can see here that Typest is complaining about this thing because we're using an unknown variable inside of our currency function, which is a Typest function at the top of my script here that will simply format amounts nicely. But we don't have to worry about this here because we actually don't really need to render this document as is. The point here is that we will replace these variables here or these placeholders with actual numbers, and then this currency function will just work and Typest will be fine. So if I were to save this and then inside of my working directory call Typest on this file recording.type, then you'd see that it of course doesn't know what command to use. Of course we need to use Typest compile, and then you see it doesn't compile because it says unknown variable. But once we've replaced this, we'll be able to render a nice PDF out of this. And in case you're wondering, okay, how do I run this on my computer? Well, then you have to install Typest on your computer. And for that you can just go onto the Typest GitHub page, go into the releases, and see here there's version 0.14. And then at the bottom of this, if you scroll all the way down, which is a lot of scrolling, then you see here that there are a bunch of assets. And with these assets, you can install Typest for your computer. So for example, if you were on Windows, which I'm sure a lot of you are, then you'd download this file here, which is a zip file. And if you unzip it, you will have a Typest executable file. You can actually see that here in my working directory. It will look like typest.exe. This is simply the Typest compiler vector. And if you were to call it not by typest compile.recording, but using this typest.exe thing, then you'd compile your document using typest. Here on the computer that I'm using for recording, this doesn't work because I'm on Ubuntu here, but in principle, the idea is the same. But I wanted to throw in a couple of pointers here in case you're confused of how to install Typest. All right, so now that we have that out of the way, let's work on loading this thing into R. So here I've created a simple script that is filled with just my working directory and two libraries that we're going to need here, namely string R and dplyr. And then we can simply use the read lines command to read the recording typed file I've just created. And if you execute this whole thing, then you'll see nothing because by default positron doesn't print the source file. But if I were to just execute it as is, you see here that I have my typest file basically printed line by line. So really, read lines gives me a line by line vector that is simply containing my typest file. And now what we can do is to find the line that has the placeholders that we've just added, namely this one here, and then replace it with other lines that are actually filling the placeholder. So let's save this thing into lines template. This will be our template file. And now if we take this lines template and find the index where we have a placeholder, for example, where we can find hourly in all caps. This will be line 112, which is of course exactly this line that we see here. So let's save this into index line template. Actually, let's call it template line because then it will be consistent with my prepared code. So now that I have this, I can actually get that line. And the way to do so is to simply take our lines template vector and access the index, this specific thing. And there we have the template that we need to replace things in. So let's save this into a variable called template line. And in order for us to have something that we can actually use to replace stuff, I have created a short little dummy data frame. So let's just throw in this code here. And as you can see, this is more or less just some collection of typical things I do when I work with clients, work on automated reports, visualize stuff, fix database connection things, deploy dashboards, and so on. And of course, there's also this line, another new entry, which is a line I have added for demo purposes. But we could also take this out here. Doesn't matter. Actually, it does matter because I forgot to take out the comma here as well. But now we have the original data set I wanted to start out with. So now our task is to take a look at our template line and replace all of these placeholders with all of the things inside of our data set, kind of iterating through the rows. And for that, we can take our df items data set and pass it to the Perl package where we use the pmap function that is supposed to return character vectors. Inside of this function, let me just first create a list that dumps each row into, well, this list. And then with this little trick, I can access all of the things like line items using L and $sign. That's the little trick I often like to use. So what we want to do with these kind of things is to take our template line and then pass it to the string replace function and then replace, say, the placeholder line item with the actual line item. And this works here, or it is functional in a sense here, because our document probably only has one placeholder that looks like this with all caps line item. If you had multiple placeholders, then you probably have to use string replace all, or you'd have to think about why you have multiple placeholders that are named the same anyway. So with that, we can basically replicate this thing by passing this through a couple of replace functions. So with hours, we can replace this with hours here, and for hourly rate we can replace this with the entry from hourly rate. And then in the last step, if we do string replace, we can replace the line amount with the entry from the line amount column. And now if we execute this thing here, we see a kind of annoying thing, namely it says replacement must be a character vector. In these kind of instances we have double vectors, which is a bit annoying. But if we were to not have this part here, we'd see that everything works and all of the placeholders, or at least all of the first placeholders, this line item placeholder was replaced, but the other thing still was left as is. So what to do? Well, we just convert things from number to character. And the way to do that is to pass this to mutate, where we say we iterate across everything. So let's do everything. And for each column that we iterate over, we apply the as character column, or not the as character column, the as character function, so that everything is turned into a character. And now if we pass this into the pmap function, this string replacing thing works properly, and we see that all of our placeholders are now actually replaced. So with that, we have a few new lines. So let's call this lines new items. And now if we have this vector, we can simply assemble our template by taking everything but this template line and replacing the template line with these other lines that we have here, basically reassembling the types document. So what we do here is we take the lines template, that's the vector full of all the entries, and then we simply take the first entry all the way to the index of the template line -1 to get the line before that. So here it ends at line 111. If I wouldn't have used the -1 here, we'd see that this includes our fake line here, or a template line. So let's include the -1, and then let's wrap this into a vector where we use our lines new items next. So that way we see that, okay, we now have our original document or our original lines of the Typest file, and then we have all of the lines that we've assembled just now, and then we can round this off by the remainder of the documents by taking not things from the first entry, but from the index of the template line +1, and then all the way until the end of the document, which means that we take a look at the length of this lines template, and then we'd see that, okay, this part would simply give me everything after the table or after the table lines. And if I put everything together, we see that we have the end of the document here. So everything from here is the end of the document. This is what we put in here. Then we have the lines that we've created. These are these lines here. And then we have everything that came before that, which is, well, this stuff. Okay, so these are our new lines for our document. And we can take these lines and then pass them to the write lines function and say write this into a file that we call out.type. And now if we do that, we see that inside of our file explorer we have a file out.type, and in there we now have all of the things that we have here. And if I were to change something in our data, let's say work on automated important reports, that's of course not simple reports I'm working on, it's always important automated reports. So let's just change this stuff here. And then if we look at our out file, we see that our Typest file now reflects that, simply because we have updated the placeholder using the string that we have specified in here. By the way, if you enjoyed this video so far, do me a favor and hit the like button, because this tells me that you enjoyed this technical content that is at the threshold of different technologies. So if you enjoy this kind of mixed content, let me know by hitting the like button. So thank you for that. And now let's get back to the video. So now we are at the last step of having to compile this stuff, because right now no one can do a thing with this Typest file because my client doesn't care about this beautiful Typest file. He just wants to get an invoice. Probably he doesn't want to get an invoice, but he gets one anyway. In any case, he cares more about a PDF invoice than about a Typest invoice. So with that said, we have to figure out a way to compile this. Namely, we have to figure out a way of how to do this Typest compile recording.type. And before I do that, let me show you that this actually works now on our newly created file. You see now that, oh, wait, this doesn't throw an error, this is working, that's cool. And if we now look into our file explorer, into our out.pdf file, we see that there is my work on automated important reports thing. So really, we have to figure out a way to do this thing, but from our R script. And even though this sounds intimidating, it's actually pretty easy. All you have to do is to call the system command, which allows you to execute commands as if you were simply typing them into your console here. And then we take what we have here and we stick it into a text. And with that, if we execute this, we'd see that, okay, This obviously worked, nothing happened, at least in the console, but we can check whether our document was created, and we can do so by re-rendering or re-executing this whole script with a modified data set. So let's say we work on automated very important reports. So not just important reports, they are also very important. They might even be critical is a good word. Let's just go with very important and critical reports. These are the things we're working on. Let's source this thing. We see no complaints by R. Let's check out our PDF file and we see that, okay, nice, this was added in here. And now I've thrown in too much nonsense and I created a new line, which actually creates formatting I do not want. So let's just keep it short and say it's only critical reports, re-executing everything and checking on the PDF. And there it is, one line again. But if I were to change my rates or my hours here, then we'd see that these subtotals here, they do not update. Let's actually check if this is true. Let's just say, okay, I'm doing 10 hours here now. And right now it says the total is about $3,000. And now if I re-render this thing, we see that this thing updated, so it is a larger invoice position now, but we still have the exact same total. And of course we want to avoid creating such invoices, so let's figure out a way to replace this stuff. And if you've been paying attention, then you know exactly the kind of technique we need for that. Namely, we first have to stick in placeholders into this. So here we have subtotal, tax, and total, and we can replace these things with placeholders like subtotal, tax, and total. And then before writing our lines, we can do more string replacements. And we can do so by passing this vector through one of the many string functions from the string R package. And here, once again, we want to have string replace all. And the first thing we want to create or replace here is the subtotal. And it should be replaced by the sum of the things that we have in our line amount column. So we just take this data set, get the line amount column, and we place the sum of that. And then if we re-execute this, we see that, okay, once again, this is complaining that what we have calculated here isn't the character. So let's actually create this outside here. Let's name this subtotal because I don't want to nest too many things into my function call here. So here I'm just going to take the subtotal variable and say, okay, as character of subtotal. And the reason why I did that is because that way subtotal is still a numeric thing and I can use it to calculate other things like the tax and the total. So if I were to replace this thing here now, I can say I want to work on the tax here, and here I want to work on the total. And then the tax is just 0.08 times the subtotal, and this here is 0.08 times the subtotal. So now if I re-render all of this, we see that R doesn't throw any complaints. And if we check into our invoice, we see that the subtotal and all the other stuff, it updated here. So that's one way of doing that. And now you could think of doing the exact same thing with these other placeholders. It doesn't actually need to be written in all caps. As long as it is a unique text, you can replace anything and you don't run at the risk of replacing something you don't want to replace. So for example, I could do the exact same thing with client, what did I say here? Client name. And I could say, okay, best client ever, that's his name, totally not making this up. And if I look into this file, into our generated PDF, we see that, okay, we are generating a bill for our best client ever now. And if you get kind of tired of having this long chain of, well, string replace functions, there is actually a tiny trick that you can use, and it simply requires refactoring this a little bit. Let me just do this up here. Let me get rid of all of the pipes, and then let's create a vector. Let's throw this in here. Let's get rid of all the string replace all stuff, and then can say that we want to replace subtotal with as character, X with as character, but with the other calculation, and then total also with as character. And then you guessed it, here we're also putting in equal sign here, and this gives us a vector of all the things we want to replace with the replace stuff. And if we call this dict as in dictionary replacements, let's just call it like that, then we can get rid of all of this stuff here and get rid of this thing and do string replace all of this dictionary replacement. And if you do and re-execute everything, you see that, okay, this still works. Let me actually show you that this did something by writing something else here. Best client ever, not gonna lie. And then doing this, you see here that this thing was updated. And once again, I added too much garbage in here and now we have a line break. Let's not do that, even though it doesn't matter. I still don't want to have that. And now everything is back to normal. But there you go. It's a nice way to generate simple documents like that. So if you have a document that you can generate in Typest and then just have to replace a couple of numbers, you can actually work with this technique and you don't need Quarto for that. So this is a nice way of keeping dependencies a bit smaller, but again, nothing wrong with using Quarto as well. I simply like this kind of technique here when things are simple, as in these kind of simple documents. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments if you did. Of course, make sure to hit all of the stuff, like button, subscribe button, whatever there is. Just give me a thumbs up, comment something cool. And with that said, I say thank you for watching and I'll see you next time.